Brother, this video is not about saying women are right or wrong, nor is it about telling anyone how they should live. It is simply about asking a question the right way, at the right time. Why are more and more women saying they don't need men? They want to make their own money, control their own lives, and become a rich man in the literal sense, not just earning enough to survive, but being the CEO, the boss, carrying the roles of stability, protection, and decision-making on their own, relying on no one else. From the outside, this looks strong, modern, and independent. Society praises this every day. But brother, if we pause for a moment, take a breath, and look more closely. Another question appears underneath. Is this truly freedom? Or is it a survival reflex carried over from the past? How many women are strong not because they want to be strong, but because they are afraid of being weak? How many are throwing themselves into work, money, and control not because of genuine passion, but because there is a voice in their head whispering that if they don't take care of themselves, no one will? When you always have to tense up to be safe, to be stable, to avoid being left behind, is that still freedom, or just a prison decorated more beautifully? This video does not take sides. It simply invites you to look honestly at something real. Sometimes, what we call strength is actually born from a fear that was never healed, and if we do not face that directly, we can live very successfully, yet still not understand why we always feel tired, tense, and alone. To understand why so many women today feel the need to carry everything themselves and stand alone, we have to go back very earlier than money, earlier than careers or society. Developmental psychology has shown something very clearly: people who grow up without a stable pillar, especially without a consistent father figure and emotional safety, are highly likely to develop a mechanism called hyperindependence, which can be understood as excessive self-reliance, not because they are better than others, not because they were born stronger, simply because at that time they had no other choice. When a child grows up not knowing whether someone will protect them tomorrow, whether anyone will stand behind them, the brain quickly learns a survival lesson. It repeats a very familiar, very simple sentence, one that can echo for a lifetime: I have to take care of myself. No one is coming to save me. And that sentence does not stay in a child's mind. It grows up with them. It enters how they love, how they work, how they see men, how they see the world. Many women do not hate men. They simply do not trust that men will be there when it matters. So they learn not to need them, they learn to make money early, control their lives, and never allow themselves to be weak. On the outside, this looks capable and independent. Inside, it is a nervous system that is always tense, always on guard, constantly preparing for the worst-case scenario. Because somewhere deep in memory, there was a time when no one came. What matters here is not blaming parents or circumstances, because most people did the best they could with what they knew, but the wound is still there, and when a wound is not recognized, it will be disguised as strength. A woman saying, "I don't need anyone," sounds confident, but sometimes behind it is a sentence that was never spoken. I needed someone once, and no one was there. So the first step is not changing behavior, not quitting work, not earning less money. The first step is simply understanding that the survival mindset you carry today may have been learned a very long time ago when you were too young to choose. And the messages the brain learned back then, if never revisited, will continue to quietly run your life. Before talking about the cost, one thing needs to be made clear fairly and honestly. Women truly are strong, and this is not a social slogan. It is a biological and evolutionary reality. For thousands of years, when life depended entirely on nature, when war, disease, and famine could take a man's life at any moment, women were the ones who were not allowed to collapse. When the environment fell apart, they did not have the privilege of sitting down and lamenting. They carried children, carried the home, carried the continuation of life itself. Because of this, the female nervous system has a remarkable ability to adapt quickly under pressure. Women observe more closely, regulate emotion more flexibly, and can shift into survival mode faster than men. Put simply, if forced to become the pillar, women can do it and do it very well. That is why in modern society, when circumstances push them into positions where they must provide for themselves, earn money, and lead, they do not break. They step into that role and fulfill it. The issue has never been whether they can. The issue is this: a survival role activated for a short period to overcome crisis is strength, but living in that role for too long becomes a burden on the nervous system. When a woman remains in a state where she must control everything, plan ahead, and always stay ahead of risk, her body never gets biological rest. The nervous system stays in alert mode, high adrenaline, high cortisol, constantly bracing for worst-case scenarios. CEOs are not exhausted because they work a lot. They are exhausted because they never get to let go, never allowed to be weak, never allowed to lean, never allowed to make mistakes. That kind of exhaustion does not show immediately, but it slowly erodes emotion, tenderness, and the capacity to connect. When you live too long in survival mode, you forget that you also possess another role, a role that does not require proving, controlling, or bracing. And that is the moment when the very strength that once saved you begins, quietly, to drain you. At this point, we need to look straight at a truth that very few people state clearly. Boss culture, CEO mindset, ultimate independence all sound powerful, impressive, and inspiring. But when you look deeper, this is also a culture that demands an extremely high psychological cost, especially from women. Data from 2024-2025 shows a sharp rise in burnout among women in leadership and senior management roles, not because they are weak, not because they are incapable, but because at the same time, they are carrying too many roles. They must be strong to survive in competitive environments. They must constantly prove their value because society remains harsher toward women in positions of power. They must hold themselves together to avoid being labeled soft or emotional. And most importantly, they are not allowed to collapse because if they do, everything behind them collapses with them. That is not pressure a single person is meant to carry over a long period of time. When money and status become tools used to soothe an inner fear, no matter how much you earn, the cost quietly accumulates. Money is not wrong. Wanting stability is not wrong either. But money earned from fear always comes with an invoice. It simply isn't delivered to your inbox. It is sent directly to your body and mind. Stress stops being temporary and becomes the baseline. Always tense, always thinking, always needing to stay ahead. The body becomes accustomed to producing cortisol, accustomed to never fully relaxing. And when the nervous system adjusts to chronic stress, emotions begin to freeze. Not because the person doesn't want to love, but because they no longer feel safe enough to open up. Tenderness disappears not because women lose their femininity, but because the nervous system does not allow softness to exist in an environment that requires constant vigilance. When you remain in control mode for too long, everything that comes toward you passes through a defensive filter. Care sounds like pressure. Closeness sounds like demand. Love, in that state, has no room to breathe. The danger of boss culture is not money, it is that it normalizes living in perpetual tension. It teaches people that exhaustion is the price you must pay, that loneliness is trivial, that emotional connection can always be postponed. Humans were not born to live like a never-ending project. You can build a career, status, and financial security, but if your entire internal system is always in alarm mode, sooner or later you will ask a very honest question. Why do I seem to have almost everything, yet still feel like I am not truly living? And that is the moment many people realize that the price they paid was not financial. It was their ability to rest, their ability to connect, and their ability to let someone enter their life without being on guard. Love was never designed as a competition of strength. It is not a place where two people stand opposite each other to see who is tougher, who controls better, who needs no one more. But when roles are reversed for too long, many modern relationships unconsciously fall into exactly that script. When both people enter a relationship carrying the same survival energy, what happens? Both tend to control because they are used to handling everything themselves. Both are defensive because they are used to relying on no one. And both find it very difficult to yield, because yielding means giving up a measure of control. At that point, the relationship is no longer a place of rest, but becomes a silent battlefield. No one wants to lose, yet no one truly wins. A good relationship is not built from two identical pieces. It is built from complementarity, where each person brings something the other does not have to strain to provide. This is not a story about men being afraid of strong women. Men are not afraid of strength. What confuses them is not knowing where they stand next to someone who is always in combat mode. When a woman must constantly lead, decide, and carry responsibility, the energy she brings into the relationship is often the energy of work, of survival. And that energy, while necessary in society, is very difficult to translate into deep intimacy and love. Many men withdraw not because they are weak, but because they do not feel they have a role, not because they want to control, but because they were never invited to simply be present. The result is that both become lonely within the relationship itself. One side feels they are carrying too much, the other feels redundant, and then both mistakenly conclude that the problem lies in gender in men, in women, when the root issue is that both are bringing the same defensive mechanism into the very place that was meant to be safe. Love cannot flourish in a constant state of vigilance. It needs one person who feels safe enough to let go, and another who is stable enough to stand there. When neither dares to do this first, the relationship remains locked in tension, even if on the surface it looks modern, equal, and perfectly fine. There is a very subtle message that modern society repeats every day so often that many people accept it as truth. The more money you make, the more things you can buy, the stronger, more independent, and more valuable you are. Advertising says this. Social media reinforces it, and many women unconsciously come to believe that if they are not fully financially autonomous, if they cannot buy everything themselves, then they are in a weaker position. But when we look at recent studies on consumer behavior, a rather opposite truth emerges. The highest spending groups are not the ones who feel the safest, most secure or happiest. On the contrary, spending increases most sharply among those who lack emotional security, not because they want to be richer, but because they are trying to fill an inner void. When emotion is not soothed, people turn to things they can control immediately, and money, along with consumption, provides that sense of control very quickly. Buying something new brings an immediate feeling of relief, but it fades just as quickly, and the loop begins again. The issue is not shopping or earning money. The issue arises when money becomes proof that I don't need anyone. Many call this independence, but in reality it is a form of defense. True independence is not shutting the door to the world and keeping everyone out. True independence is being able to stand on your own without using that ability to resist connection. It is when you do not need money to soothe the fear of abandonment, nor material things to feel enough. At that point, money returns to its proper role as a tool, not an emotional barrier. And when a woman no longer needs to prove that she needs no one, she begins to have real choice. Not choices driven by lack, but choices coming from inner fullness. That is when independence stops being a weapon and becomes a foundation for healthy connection. This world does not lack strong women. What the world truly lacks are women who no longer have to exhaust themselves by constantly holding it together just to prove they're fine. Women do not lose their value by becoming gentler. They do not become weak when they choose connection, when they choose to lean on someone at the right time, and they certainly do not fall behind when they understand that their nature is not to replace men, but to complement one another so that both can stand strong. When a woman no longer has to live in prolonged survival mode, she no longer needs to prove anything to the world. Her presence alone is enough. When you and she stand in the right roles within the relationship, everything becomes much lighter. No one has to strain to be strong, no one has to play a part, no one has to remain on guard, and no one has to live in the fear that if they soften, everything will collapse. Love, in that state, is no longer a negotiation of power. It becomes a place to breathe, to rest, to recover. Being the richest has never meant having more money than others. Being the richest means you are not facing the world alone every day. It means you can move through difficult days without putting on armor. It means knowing there is someone there not to control you, and not for you to control them, but to walk forward with you, more calmly, more steadily. And if there is one thing to remember after everything that's been said, it is this. A woman's true strength is not measured by how long she can hold herself together, but by knowing when she no longer has to,